On the 2nd of October 1928, a young Spanish priest sat alone in a Madrid retreat house and experienced something he would spend the rest of his life struggling to describe. He was 26 years old, working among the sick and the poor, and he had been carrying for several years the uneasy feeling that God was asking something specific of him. On that morning, sitting in his room with the bells ringing outside his window, he saw it. God did not want only priests and monks. He wanted the businessman at his desk, the mother at her kitchen, the professor in his lecture hall. He wanted them not despite their ordinary lives, but through them. Work was not an obstacle to holiness. Work was the path to it. The organization he founded on that idea was called Opus Dei, the work of God, and within 60 years it would operate in over 80 countries, count over 90,000 members, and accumulate wealth measured in billions. The Vatican would give it a legal status no other organization in the history of the Catholic Church had ever received, making it answerable directly to the Pope and to no one else on earth. It would be accused of being a cult, of running a global political operation under a religious cover, of enforcing a psychological discipline on its members that amounted to institutional abuse. And it would deny all of it quietly, with the particular self-assurance of an organization that knows exactly what it is doing and has no interest in explaining itself to people who have already made up their minds. This is an attempt to look at what Opus Dei actually is. Because the story is not the one Dan Brown told, it is stranger and more interesting than that. José María Escriva was born in Barbastro in the northeastern Spanish region of Aragon on the 9th of January 1902. His father, José Escriva, ran a business selling chocolate and textiles, and was by all accounts a respectable provincial merchant, moderately prosperous, devoutly Catholic in the way that most Aragonese families of his class were devoutly Catholic, meaning without particular intensity, but with genuine conviction. The young José María grew up in a household that prayed, attended Mass, and regarded the Catholic faith as simply the water in which daily life swam. When he was 2 years old, he fell gravely ill with what doctors believed to be an incurable disease. His mother Dolores carried him to the shrine of the Virgin of Torres Ciudad and prayed over him, and he recovered. She took this as a miracle. So, years later, did he. When Escriva was 12, a winter snowfall in Barbastro left behind it a trail of barefoot footprints in the snow. Footprints made by a Carmelite friar who had walked through the town in sandals despite the cold. The young Escriva, by his own account, followed the trail with his eyes and felt something shift inside him, a sense not yet formed into anything he could articulate, that total commitment to God was possible in a life, that it was not abstract, that it left physical traces in the world. These two moments, the recovery at the shrine and the footprints in the snow, are the two stories that Opus Dei's official hagiography returns to again and again in its account of the founder's formation. And while one should be careful about origin stories polished by institutional devotion, the underlying psychology they suggest is coherent. Here was a man shaped very early by the conviction that God acted directly in human lives and that human life could be shaped in response into something that bore the mark of that action. When Escriva was 14, his father's business failed. The family lost everything. They moved first to Logrono in the region of La Rioja, and later to Saragossa, the capital of Aragon, reinventing themselves with the disciplined dignity that characterized the Catholic provincial bourgeoisie of that era, who regarded public stoicism in the face of misfortune as itself a form of virtue. The collapse of the family's prosperity, combined with the deaths of 3 of José María's sisters before he reached adulthood, did not break him. It seems to have formed him in a particular direction, yes, toward the view that suffering was not meaningless, that difficulty was material to be transformed rather than simply endured, and that the ordinary texture of a hard life, work, obligation, loss, perseverance, was precisely where God was most fully encountered. He entered the seminary in Logrono in 1918 and transferred to the seminary in Saragossa in 1920. He was ordained a priest on the 28th of March, 1925 in Saragossa. He was 23 years old. He did not look particularly remarkable. He was not a mystic in any dramatic theatrical sense. He did not have visions in the conventional way that word is used in Catholic hagiography. He was a young priest doing what young priests did in 1920s Spain, working in parishes, studying canon law, attending to the unglamorous pastoral needs of ordinary people. But those who knew him in those years consistently described someone with a quality that is hard to name precisely: a focused interiority, a sense of waiting for something to clarify. He was studying at the University of Saragossa in addition to his priestly work, completing a doctoral degree in civil law that he never formally finished, but that gave him intellectual discipline and a habit of systematic thinking that would serve him for the rest of his life. He already knew, or believed he knew, that God was preparing something specific for him. What he could not yet see was its shape. The shape arrived in that room in Madrid on the 2nd of October 1928. The insight Escriva had that morning was in theological terms what is called a charism, a specific spiritual gift given not for the benefit of the recipient alone, but for the benefit of the Church as a whole. He understood it as a divine commission, a specific instruction from God about what he was to build and how. And what he was to build was something that had no real precedent in Catholic history. The Catholic Church had, for most of its existence, maintained a fairly clear hierarchy of spiritual commitment. At the top were the clergy, priests and bishops and cardinals, who had renounced the world entirely and given their lives exclusively to God. Below them in the traditional ordering were the religious monks and nuns and friars, who lived in community under vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, separated from the secular world by walls and habits and the rhythm of liturgical hours. And at the bottom, and spiritually speaking, were the laity, ordinary people living ordinary lives in the world, who could aspire to a reasonable level of Christian virtue and salvation, but who were not, in the deep structure of Catholic thought, engaged in the same project as those who had left the world behind. Escriva's insight was a direct challenge to this hierarchy, not to the institutional church, not to the authority of priests or bishops, but to the assumption that ordinary life was a lesser form of Christian existence. He believed and built his organization on the belief that a person washing dishes or drafting a legal brief or performing surgery or teaching mathematics could be pursuing exactly the same level of holiness as a contemplative monk. The key was not the activity. The key was the intention behind the activity and the awareness with which it was performed. This idea, which sounds reasonable enough stated simply, had enormous practical implications for the kind of organization that could be built around it. If holiness was possible in the middle of the world, in offices and universities and government ministries, then an organization of holy people could operate in exactly those places. It would not need to withdraw from the world. It would work within it. And the more influential the positions its members occupied in the world, the more the work of sanctification could be done. He began, in the first years after 1928, with a small group of young men in Madrid. University students mostly, meeting in the apartments of friends, talking about Escriva's ideas, praying together, or going to confession to him, listening to his informal talks about the spiritual life. The organization had no formal structure yet. It had no official recognition from the church. It was simply a priest and a group of young men who found his ideas compelling. Escriva worked simultaneously in Madrid's slums and hospitals, ministering to the sick and dying, which gave him a credibility and a grounding that pure intellectual formation would not have provided. He was not, in those years, a theorist. He was a working priest, and his theory of sanctifying ordinary work emerged from direct experience of what ordinary life, particularly difficult ordinary life, actually looked like. In 1930 he received what he understood as a second divine communication, extending the mission of Opus Dei to include women. He began a parallel women's section of the organization, which from the beginning was kept entirely separate from the men's section, a separation that has been maintained ever since, and which has been the subject of sustained criticism from feminist theologians and former members alike. The Spain into which Escriva was building this organization was not stable ground. The 1930s in Spain were a decade of accelerating political violence, the collapse of the monarchy, the establishment of the Second Republic, the political polarization between a Catholic conservative right and an increasingly radical left, and ultimately the civil war that began in 1936 when a group of nationalist military officers, Francisco Franco among them, rose against the Republican government. Opus Dei survived the civil war. Escriva fled Madrid in 1937 when Republican forces began targeting priests, crossed the Pyrenees into France with a small group of followers, and returned to Spain on the nationalist side after Franco's forces took control of the capital. This crossing is an important moment in the organization's history, and not because of the drama of the journey itself, which was genuinely dangerous, but because of what came after it. When Escriva returned to Spain in 1939, he returned to a country now governed by Francisco Franco. And in that country, Opus Dei was about to enter a period of extraordinary growth. Franco's Spain was a confessional state. Catholicism was the official religion of the regime, and the regime's relationship with the institutional church was foundational to its legitimacy. Franco presented himself as a crusader, a man who had saved Spain from godless communism and who governed in accordance with Catholic principles. The Church, in return, provided the regime with moral authority and institutional infrastructure, priest-staffed schools, Catholic doctrine-shaped legislation. The relationship between the Franco regime and Spanish Catholicism was tight, symbiotic, and mutually reinforcing in a way that would leave complicated legacies for both institutions. Opus Dei navigated this relationship with considerable skill. The organization did not become the official religious arm of the Franco regime in any simple or direct sense. Escriva himself maintained a studied distance from explicit political alignment, insisting that Opus Dei as an organization had no political position and that its members were free to hold any legitimate political view. But in practice, Opus Dei's members, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, occupied positions of significant influence within the Franco government, and the relationship between the organization and the regime during those decades is complex enough that it requires careful examination. The critical period is the late 1950s. Spain in 1957 was economically stagnant, isolated from Europe, and running the kind of autarkic economic policy, closed borders, state direction of industry, suppression of foreign investment that had kept it poor while the rest of Western Europe rebuilt and prospered after World War II. Franco faced a choice. He could continue the economic nationalism that had defined the first 2 decades of his regime, or he could open Spain to the global economy and the technocratic rationalism that was transforming Western Europe into the most prosperous region in human history. He chose to open, and the men he chose to execute that opening were, to a remarkable degree, members or associates of Opus Dei. In February 1957, a group of economists and technocrats associated with Opus Dei were brought into key positions in the Spanish government. Alberto Ullastres became Minister of Commerce. Mariano Navarro Rubio became Minister of Finance. Laureano López Rodo became a senior figure in the planning apparatus. These men were not identical in their Opus Dei affiliations. Some were full members, some were associates. Some simply moved in the same circles. But they shared a common intellectual formation, a Catholic technocratic rationalism that believed scientific economic management was not only compatible with Catholicism, but was in fact an expression of it, a form of serving God through competent stewardship of the material world. What they produced was the Stabilization Plan of 1959, which dismantled the autarkic policies of the previous 2 decades, opened Spain to foreign investment, devalued the currency, reduced the budget deficit, and launched Spain on a trajectory of economic growth that by the mid-1960s was among the fastest in the world. The period became known as the Spanish Miracle, and for the first time in its history, Opus Dei found itself publicly associated with something that most people, including most critics of Franco, had to concede was a genuine achievement. The association with the Spanish Miracle did 2 things for Opus Dei simultaneously. It gave the organization a reputation for competent, serious, rational, technocratic governance that would follow it for decades, and made its members attractive candidates for positions of responsibility in governments and institutions far beyond Spain. And it raised, for the first time at serious volume, the question that has never entirely gone away. Was Opus Dei a religious organization that happened to produce economically competent members? Or was the economic and political penetration of Spanish governance the point, the actual operational objective of an organization that used religious formation as its recruitment and discipline mechanism? Escriva's answer, consistently and emphatically repeated throughout his life, was the former. Opus Dei formed people spiritually. What those people then did with their professional lives was their own affair as citizens and professionals. The organization did not direct them politically. It did not instruct them on how to vote, or whom to appoint, or what policies to pursue. It gave them a spiritual formation, and then released them into the world to exercise their own professional judgment. This was and remains the official position. Former members, and there have been a significant number of them willing to speak publicly, have described a more complicated reality. To understand the dispute, you have to understand how Opus Dei actually functions internally. Because the internal structure of Opus Dei is not what most people picture when they imagine a religious organization, and understanding it is essential to evaluating claims made both by the organization and by its critics. Opus Dei divides its members into several distinct categories based on their level of commitment and their manner of life. The largest group, constituting the great majority of the membership, are called supernumeraries. Supernumeraries are married members, or members who have not committed to celibacy, who live ordinary secular lives in the world. They have jobs, families, mortgages, social lives. They're what most people would consider normal members of society in every visible respect. Their connection to Opus Dei is through a program of spiritual formation that involves daily prayer, weekly attendance at an Opus Dei Center for Spiritual Direction and Discussion, periodic retreats, regular confession to an Opus Dei priest, and the practice of what Escriva called the plan of life, a structured framework for integrating prayer and consciousness of God into every part of the working day. The plan of life is not a loose suggestion, it is a daily architecture. It includes Mass each morning where possible, a half hour of mental prayer each morning, a brief midday prayer, the Rosary prayed in full, a short examination of conscience before bed, spiritual reading taken in small portions throughout the day, and weekly confession to an Opus Dei priest. For a person who is also raising children and working a demanding professional job, this adds up to a substantial reorganization of daily time and daily attention. The point in Escriva's theology was precisely that point. The reorganization was the sanctification. A person who has integrated that level of prayer into a working life has made their working life into something qualitatively different from what it would otherwise be. Whether that is a gift to the person or a demand on them, and whether there is a meaningful difference between those two things in the context of a community that strongly expects it, is one of the questions that has divided accounts of Opus Dei for decades. Supernumeraries are the public face of Opus Dei in most contexts. They are the lawyers and doctors and academics and politicians whose membership in Opus Dei, if known, prompts the raised eyebrows and the dark suspicions. They typically do not advertise their membership. This discretion is sometimes described by critics as secrecy. The organization prefers the word privacy, pointing out that religious affiliation is generally considered a private matter. The debate about this distinction is not entirely semantic. The second major category is the numeraries. Numeraries are celibate members who live in Opus Dei centers, communal residences that function as the organizational and spiritual hubs of the work in each city. They are the internal engine of the organization. They work in ordinary professional jobs in the world, and they contribute most or all of their professional income to Opus Dei, which in return provides their housing, their food, and their expenses. They are not priests in the great majority of cases, but they live with a regularity and discipline closer to religious life than to ordinary secular life. They follow the plan of life with greater intensity than supernumeraries. They participate in the internal governance of Opus Dei centers. They are responsible for the spiritual direction of supernumeraries and of the associate members and cooperators who move in Opus Dei's broader orbit. It is at this level, the level of the numeraries, that Opus Dei's most controversial practices are found. The most discussed of these practices is what Opus Dei calls corporal mortification. This is not a concept Opus Dei invented. It has a long history in Catholic spiritual life, rooted in the theology of redemptive suffering, the idea that physical discomfort voluntarily accepted can be offered to God as a form of prayer, united to the suffering of Christ, and made spiritually fruitful. What Opus Dei's The Way, Escriva's foundational spiritual text published in 1934, prescribes is specific. The numeraries are expected to sleep on a board one night per week, or alternatively on the floor. They are expected to wear for 2 hours each day a cilice, a small spiked chain worn around the upper thigh, which causes discomfort and in some cases minor skin irritation. They are expected to practice the discipline, a brief self-flagellation performed weekly in a private room. These practices are not secret. Opus Dei discusses them openly in its own publications. The organization's position is that they are voluntary, that they are practiced in moderation, that they are part of a centuries-old Catholic tradition of asceticism, and that their purpose is spiritual rather than punitive, training the will, cultivating detachment from physical comfort, and maintaining a consciousness of Christ's passion. Critics, including a substantial number of former numeraries who have spoken publicly, describe a different experience. They describe social pressure to practice these mortifications even when they cause genuine pain. They describe the culture of silence and non-complaint around physical discomfort, which made it difficult to report problems. They describe the cilice not as a minor inconvenience, but as a device that, worn improperly or for too long, caused wounds that required medical attention. One former numerary in a memoir that became widely read in Catholic circles described waking each morning with blood on the sheet from the previous night's discipline, and understanding this as entirely normal, as the expected and desired outcome of the practice. Opus Dei responds to these accounts by pointing to the substantial majority of former numeraries who do not report abuse, by emphasizing that all mortification is meant to be moderate and supervised, and by noting that the practices in question are no different from those voluntarily practiced by members of many traditional Catholic religious orders. The dispute is real, and it is not easily resolved, because the question of whether a practice is abusive depends substantially on the context in which it is undertaken, the degree of social pressure surrounding it, and whether the person undertaking it genuinely feels free to stop. The question of freedom is central to the most serious criticism Opus Dei faces, which is not about the cilice but about the totality of the formation it provides and the degree to which members are genuinely free to leave it. Opus Dei asks of its numeraries in particular a commitment that structures essentially every dimension of their lives. Their social world is centered on the Opus Dei center where they live. Their spiritual direction comes from Opus Dei. Their professional work is, in many cases, directed toward organizations affiliated with Opus Dei, or in which Opus Dei has an interest. Their reading, their friendships, their use of free time, all of this is subject to the guidance of their spiritual director, who is an Opus Dei priest. Former numeraries describe a world that is in practical terms quite closed. Not violently so, not with locked doors or physical coercion, but closed in the way that a total institution is always closed, through the gradual replacement of outside reference points with inside ones, through the subtle social cost of non-compliance, through the difficulty of imagining a self that exists outside the structure that has been built around you. Several former members who have spoken publicly describe leaving Opus Dei as one of the most psychologically difficult experiences of their lives, not because anyone prevented them from leaving, but because the person they had been outside the organization had, over years of intensive formation, become largely inaccessible to them. The organization disputes this characterization strongly, pointing to the hundreds of thousands of people who have left Opus Dei, in the case of supernumeraries particularly, without apparent difficulty, and arguing that the experience of numeraries who find leaving hard is not representative of the membership as a whole. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. The experience of supernumeraries and the experience of numeraries are not the same experience. I want to stop here for a moment because when I was researching this, I found myself genuinely uncertain about how to characterize what Opus Dei does internally, and I think that uncertainty is worth being honest about. The accounts of former members who describe their time in Opus Dei as damaging are not, in most cases, accounts of crude physical coercion or obvious abuse. They are accounts of a more subtle process, the experience of being formed by an institution so thoroughly that the self becomes dependent on the institution in ways that are not recognized until the attempt to leave reveals them. That is a real and serious thing. It is also a thing that can happen in organizations that are not, by any conventional definition, cults or abusive. Intense religious communities, military academies, highly demanding professional cultures can all produce something like this effect in people who commit to them fully. The question of whether Opus Dei crosses a line that other demanding institutions do not cross is not one I can answer definitively, and anyone who tells you they can answer it without having spent significant time with both committed members and former members is not being fully honest with you. What I can be more definitive about is the external structure of Opus Dei's influence in the world, because that is less a matter of interpretation and more a matter of record, and the record is substantial. Opus Dei operates a global network of educational institutions. It runs universities in Spain, in Peru, in Colombia, in the Philippines, and in Kenya. It operates secondary schools and primary schools and professional training centres in dozens of countries. It runs university residence halls, student centres, and academic programs in cities across Europe, North America, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The educational network is not small. It is a significant part of Opus Dei's operational footprint, and it is designed with a specific purpose. Escriva was explicit from the early days of the organization that the primary targets for Opus Dei's formation were not the masses. They were the leaders, the people who would go on to occupy positions of influence in government, in the professions, in academia, in finance, and in culture. The logic was straightforward. If you could form the people who made the decisions, you could shape the world more effectively than any program of mass evangelization could. This is the logic of elite formation, and Opus Dei has pursued it with a consistency and a sophistication that no other Catholic lay organization has matched. The results of that pursuit are visible in the membership rolls, to the extent that those rolls can be reconstructed from public information, official membership lists not being something Opus Dei publishes. In Spain, over the decades since the Spanish Miracle, Opus Dei members have occupied ministerial positions in governments of both the left and the right, though more consistently and prominently on the right. In the United States, a country where Opus Dei has grown substantially since the 1940s, the organization's members and associates have included federal judges, intelligence officials, prominent academics, and political figures. The names most frequently cited in American political commentary in connection with Opus Dei are Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas, two Supreme Court justices whose jurisprudential philosophy and Catholic faith intersected in ways that made their possible Opus Dei connections a subject of intense speculative interest among liberal commentators. The truth, as best as it can be established, is more complicated. Scalia was not a member of Opus Dei. He was friendly with some of its members and attended some events associated with the organization. Thomas has had similar associations. Neither was an enrolled numerary or supernumerary in any documented sense. But the question of what association with Opus Dei means short of formal membership is itself not a simple one, because the organization maintains a category of cooperators, people who support Opus Dei's work financially or practically without being members, and a wider circle of people influenced by its formation without formal affiliation. In the world of intelligence and national security, the name most prominently associated with Opus Dei in the United States is Robert Hanssen, a senior FBI counterintelligence officer who was arrested in 2001 and convicted of spying for the Soviet Union and then Russia over a period of more than 2 decades, one of the most damaging espionage cases in American history. Hansen was a member of Opus Dei. He attended Mass at an Opus Dei church in Washington. He had friends within the organization. His case became a major source of public attention to Opus Dei in the United States, precisely because the juxtaposition of his devout Catholic practice, his Opus Dei membership, and his decades of betrayal of his country to the country's most dangerous enemy is difficult to reconcile with the image of an organization of spiritually serious, ethically committed professionals. Opus Dei's response was to note, entirely reasonably, that an organization of 90,000 people will inevitably include some who do terrible things, that no institution can be held responsible for the secret crimes of individual members, and that Hansen's espionage had nothing to do with Opus Dei and was in fact a betrayal of everything the organization stood for. All of that is fair. It is also fair to note that the case reminded a lot of people that institutions with a strong culture of secrecy and a trained ability to compartmentalize information are, by their nature, environments that can be inhabited comfortably by people who are doing things they have chosen to keep secret. That observation is not a charge, it is an observation. The Vatican's relationship with Opus Dei has been the source of some of the most intense internal Catholic controversy in the 20th century. Escriva spent decades seeking formal recognition from Rome for his organization and its novel theological premise, the sanctification of ordinary work by lay people in the world. The process was complicated by the fact that no existing category in canon law, the legal framework of the Catholic Church, fit what Opus Dei was. It was not a religious order, because its members did not take vows and did not live separated from the world. It was not a simple lay association, because it had a priestly component and a level of internal discipline and governance that went far beyond what ordinary lay associations possessed. It was something genuinely new, and the Vatican's canonists and theologians took a long time to figure out what to do with it. The first formal approval came in 1950, when Pope Pius XII recognized Opus Dei as a secular institute, a category that acknowledged its lay character while giving it official standing within the Church. But Escriva was not satisfied with secular institute status. He believed it misrepresented what Opus Dei was, because it implied that Opus Dei was composed of people who had taken some form of vows, however informal, when in fact Opus Dei's founding premise was precisely that its members made no such formal consecration, but simply lived their ordinary lives with a particular spiritual commitment. He spent the last 2 decades of his life lobbying Rome for a different, more accurate canonical status. He died in 1975 without achieving it. The achievement came under his successor as Opus Dei's leader, Álvaro del Portillo, and under the pontificate of Pope John Paul II. On the 28th of November 1982, John Paul II issued the Apostolic Constitution ut Sit, which established Opus Dei as a personal prelature. This is the moment that Opus Dei's supporters describe as the proper canonical recognition of what the organization had always been, and that Opus Dei's critics describe as the moment the organization received a level of institutional autonomy within the Church that no other organization has ever possessed. A personal prelature is, in canon law, a structure that has its own head, called a prelate, who has jurisdictional authority over the clergy and the faithful who belong to the prelature, regardless of where they live in the world. The key word is personal, as opposed to territorial, A diocese. The ordinary unit of Catholic governance has jurisdiction over all Catholics in a specific geographic area. A personal prelature has jurisdiction over specific people, its members, wherever they happen to be in the world. The practical implication for Opus Dei is significant. The priests of Opus Dei and the lay members who fall under Opus Dei's jurisdiction are not subject to the authority of the local bishop of wherever they happen to live. They are subject to the authority of Opus Dei's prelate, who is in Rome, and through him to the Pope. The local bishop has no authority over them. Opus Dei is, in this structural sense, a church within the church, with its own governance, its own clergy, its own institutional logic, and a direct line of accountability to the Vatican that bypasses the ordinary diocesan structure entirely. So the significance of this cannot be overstated in terms of institutional independence. In practical Catholic life, the bishop is the centre of authority in his territory. Priests need the bishop's permission to operate in his diocese. Religious orders need his approval to work within his boundaries. Lay organizations need his recognition. Opus Dei needs none of these things. An Opus Dei centre can open in a diocese without the bishop's approval. An Opus Dei priest can minister to Opus Dei members in that diocese without the bishop's endorsement. The bishop cannot tell Opus Dei what to do, and Opus Dei is under no canonical obligation to tell the bishop what it is doing. This has been the source of considerable tension between Opus Dei and local church hierarchies in numerous countries over the years. Bishops have complained of organizations operating in their territory without transparency. They have complained of Opus Dei recruiting the laity without informing local pastors. They have complained of what they describe as a separatist mentality, an orientation of Opus Dei members toward their own organization structures rather than toward the broader life of the local church. Opus Dei's response has consistently been to refer to its canonical status and its direct accountability to Rome, which is technically correct and has done little to improve its relationships with local bishops. The relationship between Opus Dei and the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, deserves particular attention because it illuminates some of the deepest fault lines in 20th century Catholicism. The two organizations represent, in a meaningful sense, competing visions of what Catholicism should be doing in the modern world. The Jesuits, founded in the 16th century by Ignatius of Loyola, have historically been associated with intellectual engagement with the modern world, with a willingness to enter into dialogue with secular thought and culture, and in the 20th century particularly with a political theology that has often allied itself with the poor, with social justice movements, and in Latin America with what became known as liberation theology. The Jesuits, after the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, moved toward what critics called accommodation with the modern world and what supporters called genuine dialogue with it. Opus Dei moved in the opposite direction. Escriva was deeply skeptical of the direction the Church took after the Second Vatican Council, and Opus Dei under his leadership maintained a strongly traditional Catholic identity, emphasizing obedience to Rome, traditional liturgical practice, and resistance to the theological innovation that the Jesuits in particular were associated with. The two organizations came to represent for many observers the two poles of post-conciliar Catholicism, and their relationship has been one of mutual suspicion and occasional open hostility for decades. When John Paul II, who was deeply sympathetic to Opus Dei and elevated its founder Escriva to sainthood in 2002, also moved to rein in what he saw as Jesuit theological adventurism, restricting the Jesuits in ways that had not been done since their suppression in the 18th century. Many saw in this a shift in the Vatican's institutional favour that reflected Opus Dei's influence. The beatification of Escriva in 1992 and his canonization in 2002, making him a saint of the Catholic Church, were among the most controversial ecclesiastical events in recent Catholic history. Critics argued that the process was rushed, that the investigation into his life had been conducted in a way that suppressed negative testimony, and that numerous witnesses who had known Escriva personally and had unflattering things to say about his character had been ignored or discouraged from participating. Former members of Opus Dei submitted testimony describing Escriva as autocratic, temperamental, and capable of cruelty toward those who displeased him. His documented statements about Jews, made in a 1941 letter in which he described himself as son of a rabbi as a metaphor for his relationship to tradition, and various other statements recorded by associates, were raised as evidence of prejudices inconsistent with saintly character. The Vatican's position was that the investigation had been thorough, that the evidence for Escriva's heroic virtue was clear, and that the negative testimony reflected misunderstanding or personal grievance rather than accurate observation. He is today officially Saint Josemaria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei, and his feast day is celebrated on the 26th of June. The financial dimension of Opus Dei is one of the most difficult aspects of the organization to assess with confidence, partly because Opus Dei does not publish comprehensive financial accounts, and partly because its financial structure is deliberately distributed across multiple, legally distinct entities in multiple countries, making any overall picture necessarily incomplete. What is known from partial disclosures, journalistic investigation, and the accounts of former members who had financial responsibilities within the organization is that Opus Dei is wealthy, on a scale that puts it among the most financially substantial Catholic organizations in the world. The numeraries who live in Opus Dei centers typically contribute their entire professional income to the organization. In cities like New York, London, Madrid, Rome, and Chicago, where Opus Dei maintains centers, this means that a group of professionals, each earning salaries typical of their fields, are collectively providing substantial revenue. The centers themselves own significant real estate. The universities and schools affiliated with Opus Dei in various countries are substantial institutions with their own assets. The cooperators and supporters who fund Opus Dei's work without being formal members include individuals of significant private wealth in multiple countries. The University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain, which is the most prominent of Opus Dei's educational institutions, is a substantial university with a medical school, a business school, and a law school, and an international reputation. It requires ongoing financial support of the kind that only a wealthy parent organization can reliably provide. The most dramatic public intersection of Opus Dei with the world of high finance came in the 1980s, in the context of what became known as the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, one of the most extraordinary banking collapses in European history. Banco Ambrosiano was an Italian bank with deep connections to the Vatican, run by a banker named Roberto Calvi, whose relationships with the Vatican Bank, with the Sicilian Mafia, with the Italian secret services, and with the shadowy Masonic Lodge Propaganda Due, commonly known as P2, made him one of the most dangerously networked individuals in Italian finance. In 1982, Calvi was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge in London. His death was initially ruled a suicide. It was later reclassified as murder. The investigation into who killed him and why has occupied Italian courts for decades and has never resulted in a conviction. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano left behind debts of over $1 billion, a significant portion of which was owed to or through the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank's involvement in the Ambrosiano affair was deeply embarrassing to the Holy See and generated an international financial and legal crisis that required resolution. The person most prominently associated with the financial stabilization of the Vatican's position in the aftermath of the Ambrosiano collapse was Monsignor Álvaro del Portillo, the head of Opus Dei and his organization. The precise nature of the financial relationship between Opus Dei and the Vatican in this period is not fully documented in public records, but multiple investigators and journalists who have covered the story in depth have concluded that Opus Dei provided financial support to the Vatican in its hour of need, and that the personal prelature status granted to Opus Dei by John Paul II 2 months after the Ambrosiano collapse became public might be understood at least in part in that context. Whether that reading is accurate, whether it is fair, whether it represents cause and effect or coincidence of timing, is a question that neither the Vatican nor Opus Dei has ever directly addressed. The timeline is what it is. The question of Opus Dei's influence in American politics has been a persistent theme in American journalism, particularly since the early 2000s, and it requires careful handling because the temptation to see Opus Dei, members behind every conservative Catholic policy position, is as intellectually lazy as denying any network effect at all. What is documented is this. The United States has somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Opus Dei members, a small number in a country of 330 million. But those members are disproportionately concentrated in certain professional sectors: law, medicine, academia, government, finance, and in certain geographic locations: New York, Washington, Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco. The concentration in Washington in particular has attracted the most attention. Opus Dei operates a center in Washington that has over the years attracted members working in the federal government, in congressional staffs, in executive branch agencies, and in the federal judiciary. The center at the Catholic Information Center in downtown Washington, which is affiliated with Opus Dei, has been a meeting point for Catholic conservatives in the capital for decades. Attorney General William Barr, who served under 2 Republican administrations, has spoken at events there. Supreme Court justices have appeared. The centre functions as a point of social and intellectual gravity for Catholic conservatives in a city where such gravity has significant consequences for policy and appointments. The picture that emerges is not one of an Opus Dei command centre directing policy. It is one of a social and intellectual network, dense with mutual acquaintance, shared formation, and common theological commitments, that has demonstrably shaped the careers and connections of its participants. Whether that constitutes a power structure depends on what you think power structures require. The global reach of Opus Dei in the early 21st century can be described in general outline even in the absence of comprehensive official data. The organization operates in over 80 countries. Its membership of approximately 90,000 is concentrated in Spain, where the organization began and where it has deepest institutional roots, and in Latin America, which has historically been a major field of Opus Dei's educational and pastoral work. It is present throughout Western Europe, with significant presence in Italy, France, Germany, the United Kingdom and Ireland. Its work in sub-Saharan Africa has grown substantially in recent decades, particularly in Kenya and Nigeria. In Asia, it has centres in Japan, the Philippines, India, and several other countries. The institutional form it takes in each country varies. Where it has established educational institutions, as in Spain, Peru, and the Philippines, those institutions are a primary vehicle of its influence. Where it operates primarily through centres for professionals, as in the United States and Britain, the influence works through the formation and networking of individuals in key sectors. The common thread is the targeting of what Escriva called the leaders, the people in each country and each sector who set the tone and make the decisions. What is Opus Dei building toward? This is the question that sits at the centre of every serious discussion of the organisation, and it is a question that has multiple possible answers depending on how you credit its various communications. The official answer, which Opus Dei has given consistently since its founding, is that it is building nothing in a political or worldly sense. It is forming people who are trying to live ordinary lives with extraordinary spiritual depth, and what those people then do in the world, with their professional competence and their moral formation, is up to them as free citizens. The organisation is not a political project, it is a spiritual one. This is the answer you get from committed members, from the organisation's official communications, from its theologians and its priests. It is not an answer invented for public relations. It is genuinely what most Opus Dei members believe they are participating in. The more sceptical answer, developed by critics from a range of perspectives across several decades, is that an organisation that systematically recruits the most ambitious and talented young people it can find, gives them an intensive formation that includes significant elements of loyalty to the organisation, places them in elite educational and professional institutions, maintains close ongoing relationships with them through their careers, and operates globally with a direct line of accountability to the Vatican is, whatever its theological self-understanding, a political project of the most sophisticated kind. Not a conspiracy in the thriller sense, not a group of men in a room deciding who wins elections, but something more structural and in some ways more durable than that. A network of people who share a common formation, who trust each other in ways they do not trust outsiders, who understand the world through a common theological and moral lens, and who are disproportionately found in the rooms where consequential decisions are made. The two answers are not entirely incompatible. They are describing the same organisation from different vantage points. The question of which vantage point is more accurate, or whether accuracy requires holding both simultaneously, is one that I do not think has a simple resolution. What I can say is that the history of institutions which have pursued elite formation as a long-term strategy, from the Jesuits, whose methods Escriva explicitly studied to the great universities, which were themselves originally religious foundations, suggests that the gap between spiritual formation and worldly influence is consistently narrower than either the institutions or their critics would like to admit. You form people. Those people go out into the world. They carry what you gave them. They trust the others you formed. They build. That is not a conspiracy. That is how institutions work. And Opus Dei is, whatever else it may be, one of the most effectively functioning institutions of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Escriva's The Way, his foundational text, contains a sentence that I kept returning to while researching this. It reads, in the English translation, "Do not say that man has a bad character. Say, rather, that he has not yet been formed." The sentence is presented as a counsel of charity, an instruction to be patient with human imperfection on the grounds that character is malleable and formation is possible. It is also, if you read it in the context of everything else Escriva built, a statement of organizational philosophy. Character is not given, character is made, and if you control the making, you shape what comes out. That is the logic of every serious institution that has ever taken formation seriously. It is the logic of the Jesuits, whose suppression created the vacuum that made the Illuminati possible. It is the logic of Skull and Bones at Yale, which has been selecting and forming young Americans for nearly 200 years. It is the logic of the great military academies, the great law schools, the great hospitals with their residency programs, and it is, stripped of its theological framing, the core logic of Opus Dei. Not that God does not exist, not that the spiritual formation is insincere, but that the formation of character at scale, in strategically selected people, in strategically relevant sectors, is itself a form of power, one of the oldest and most durable forms of power that human institutions have ever discovered. The relationship between that kind of power and the kind that is visible in elections and appointments and financial flows is not direct. It is not a chain of command. It is something more like a shared set of lenses through which the world is perceived and through which decisions are made and through which people are evaluated and trusted and advanced. An Opus Dei numerary who has been formed by the organization from his early 20s does not receive instructions from Rome about how to vote on a particular court case or whom to hire for a particular position. He applies to those decisions a set of values and a set of relationships and a set of intuitions about what good judgment looks like that the organization has spent years helping him develop. And those values and relationships and intuitions shape the outcome. And whether that is influence or whether it is simply the natural consequence of taking formation seriously is a question I genuinely do not know how to answer. I am not sure it is possible to answer cleanly. The boundary between deep formation and institutional direction is, in any serious organization, deliberately difficult to locate. What I do know, having spent a significant amount of time reading the organization's own documents, reading the accounts of former members, reading the academic scholarship on Opus Dei, which has grown substantially over the past 30 years, and reading the journalism that has tracked its activities across multiple countries and decades, is that Opus Dei is not what Dan Brown said it was. It is not a cult of self-flagellating assassins protecting ancient secrets. It is not a sinister shadow organization secretly running the Western world from a basement in Rome. Those images are fictions, generated by the same anxiety about hidden power that produces conspiracy theories in every generation. But it's also not simply a benign, voluntary association of Catholic professionals who happen to take their faith seriously. It is a large, wealthy, globally distributed, highly disciplined organization whose explicit purpose is to form and place people of influence in the world's most consequential institutions, and which has been pursuing that purpose with remarkable consistency for nearly a century. The question of what that means, of whether it is something to be welcomed or worried about, of whether the distinction between spiritual formation and institutional power is as real as Opus Dei claims it is not a question that comfortable certainty resolves. It is a question that requires the kind of sustained attention that most of us prefer not to give to things that do not announce their presence loudly. Opus Dei does not announce its presence loudly. It never has. It was built by a man who believed that God wanted people to work quietly in the world, sanctifying it through competence and dedication and daily prayer, without calling attention to themselves. Whether that quietness is the humility of genuine faith, or the tactical discipline of an organization that understands that visibility creates opposition is, once again, a question that the evidence does not cleanly resolve. Maybe it is both. The most interesting things usually are. There is chapel in the Opus Dei Prelatic Church in Rome, on the Viale Bruno Buozzi, where Josemaria Escriva is buried. People go there every day. Priests, nuns, ordinary Catholics, tourists, people in suits, people in jeans, people who have come from very far away, and who kneel at the tomb for a long time before rising and leaving. Whatever Opus Dei is as an institution, whatever the political and financial and ecclesiastical reality of a 90,000-member global organization with billions in assets and members in positions of influence across 5 continents, what draws those people to that chapel is not power. It is the same thing that drew a young Spanish priest out of a Madrid retreat house in 1928, convinced he had heard something real and important and specific, convinced that ordinary life, the life most people live, could be made into something holy, convinced that the work of your hands and your mind offered to God with full attention was not a lesser form of devotion, but the form most suited to the world as it actually is. Whether he was right about that, whether the institution he built to pursue that conviction has honoured it or corrupted it or both, is a question that the history of the work of God does not answer simply. It is the question the history raises, and it is, in the end, the question that matters.